So the second paper this afternoon is from Mary Cahill. Now, this session is a session of X's because Mary is formerly the keeper of Irish Antiquities at the National Museum. I'm an X as well, and so is Elizabeth. We're all retired in different ways. None of us really retired. But also, Elizabeth, as you know, beg your pardon, Mary, who's also a graduate of Cork, like Elizabeth. Mary has done an enormous amount of work over the years on Bronze Age gold work. And I'm really interested in what she has to say about lunulae, because I was once involved with Mary in the repatriation, what to put it that way, of a lunulae, which had been discovered somewhere in Ireland, getting it back into the museum. I've also always been intrigued myself by the fact that you get these recurrence of motifs. Elizabeth has spoken about the motifs in megalithic art. I myself I was always intrigued by the same motifs turning up in Iron Age art, and what we call Latin art in Ireland, especially because at Loughcrew you get Iron Age art occurring, where you also get megalithic art occurring. But Mary is actually dealing with lunulae and the carvings on them, and I think I will leave it to Mary to develop it from there. I'm not sure exactly where it will go, so it'll be very interesting. Thanks, Mary.
Where is she?
Yeah.
We're not exes of one another now.
No. Yes, yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here and honoured to have been asked to contribute this conference to honour George. I was 18 years of age. I had just finished first year in UCC when I went to work for a few weeks at Newgrange, and one day Professor Kelly said, "Will we go over to Nowth and see what they're at over there?" And I was the only student left at that point in the late summer, and so Professor Kelly brought me over to Nowth, and I was introduced to George. We were entertained to tea and biscuits, and I was sitting there saying, "My God, here I am. I have Professor M.J. O'Kelly on one side, and I have George Ogan on the other side." And you know, what first year wouldn't have been absolutely thrilled and probably a bit nervous of being in such company. So a few years later, I joined the staff of the National Museum, and of course, George was one of our most regular visitors for his research, social occasions, whatever it was. So we became very good friends and colleagues over the years. And as my interest in prehistoric gold developed, of course, we had even more things to talk about. And I can't say he always necessarily agreed with me with some of my ideas. I'm not sure he was into the idea of body piercing that much, but we always had some great discussions. And any time you had even a 2-page off-print to offer him, you would get just such a lovely note in his beautiful handwriting to thank you, and to thank you for the contribution that you had made. So it's great pleasure and a little trepidation that I offered this paper today, because it's a little bit different when it comes to the idea of how we might look at lunulae and think of them in a different way. So some of you might remember a few years ago in an article in Archaeology Ireland, I wrote about some ideas I have about how we might interpret gold discs, which are amongst the earliest of the gold artifacts that are produced in Ireland. And in that article, I suggested that perhaps lunulae could be considered as something more than just personal ornaments, that they might actually represent the solar boat, in other words, the boat that carries the disk, the sun disk, on its journey through the sky from day to night. And I suppose here I might introduce my lunula, made for me specially for today by Carol Smith from the museum. And the question that I ask myself, and perhaps ask you as well, is if you met me on some amazing occasion, some early Bronze Age occasion, would you think I was wearing a boat or a ship, if I manipulated this around my neck, if I wore it down here, perhaps with some attachment, some leather thong perhaps, to wear it on my chest? Would you think I was wearing a boat? So if you don't, then I hope I will persuade you that perhaps I am. So Before we get into the detail of that, I just want to sort of put this in a little bit of context by using the work of Peter Wells, the American anthropologist, from his very interesting book, How Ancient Europeans Saw the World. And what he says is that we encounter designs that we think that they contain images that we understand, that we know their meaning, but we cannot be certain that they do. What we see as an image might not be recognized as such by members of the society that produced it, whereas the latter might see an image where none appears to us. Any complex, crafted, or arranged object can be understood as a diagram of the way that those who made them believed that their societies worked and the way they related to the world in which they lived. This is referred to as a visual ideology and refers to the ways that visual elements interrelate in expressing the worldview or essence of a community's culture. And an important point that he makes is that objects played a much more important role as media for communication in societies that did not have writing than they do in ours. So you might just keep those thoughts in your mind as we work through. Another couple of points, just as a kind of a preamble, if you like, and a kind of a background to what I'm going to say as we go on, is about the idea of symbolism and how we should try to understand symbolism. So a very interesting book called Symbol and Magic in Egyptian Art by R.H. Wilkinson had some interesting discussion about this very point, understanding symbolism. So symbolism can be expressed at primary and secondary levels of association. So in primary or direct association, the form of the object suggests concepts, ideas, or identities with which that object is directly related. So an object, for example, associated with a specific Egyptian deity suggests that god or goddess, and by extension, a concept associated with that deity. And in secondary association, the form of the object suggests another different form which has its own symbolic significance. It transcends the purely coincidental and takes on symbolic meaning and importance, resulting in the adaptation of forms, domestic, funerary, and cultic, to symbolic shapes. For example, amulets in the form of cowrie shells, which represent female genitalia and fertility. So the shape of the object then suggests this idea of association with the fertility of the female. Or, for example, bunches of grapes, which to the Egyptians are similar to the heart, and thus, because of that, take on the idea of representing life itself, the heart obviously being essential to the maintenance of life. And just to give you a couple of examples, you might be familiar with the Jed pillar, which represents the backbone of Osiris and also represents stability and duration. The mirror, in other words, the solar disk, is carried by the pillar, as you see here in the slide, and refers to Osiris, the night form of the sun in the netherworld, and to Re rising in the heavens. Mirrors themselves also represent the solar disk, and the lotus flower, which opens and closes with the movement of the sun. So it closes in the evening at dusk and it opens in the morning with the sun. It's also regarded as a very important solar image in Egyptian mythology because, again, it mimics that solar journey. So these simple forms are complex expressions making powerful statements in their own right. And it's in that sort of context that I'd like to suggest you would open your minds, I suppose, to some of the thoughts that I will present shortly on lunulae themselves. So just to look at some of the earliest gold work from Ireland and other parts of Europe, here you see these strips, perhaps a diadem here from Belleville in County Cavan, these other decorated bands here that are perforated, showing close resemblance to objects here from northern Spain. Here, these perhaps basket earrings, one from County Down, the only one we have from Ireland. There are many more from England. and you can see how closely it relates to these from Northern Europe. The discs themselves are best known from Ireland because the largest number of them have been found here, but they are also found in Britain, Portugal, and Spain. They occur mostly in pairs. Their function is not fully understood in the sense of how they might have been used or worn on the body, but they appear designed to represent different aspects of the sun as seen with the naked eye. Lunulae are, at their most basic definition, sheet gold ornaments of crescentic shape, but within that there is a huge variation amongst them. So as we heard mentioned this morning, they're all the same, but nonetheless they're all different. And here on the screen you see, I suppose, that an expression of the best and worst of lunulae, the largest and, if not quite the smallest, but the smaller one. You see a beautiful lunula from near Athlone in County Roscommon. It's the biggest by far, and also the heaviest of the Irish lunulae, but not at all the heaviest of lunulae that have been found. That honour goes to the only lunula that's known from Wales. So here on the left-hand side from near Athlone, we have a really finely made, expertly produced lunula, and on the other side, we have a very poor example from, you'll see it published as Naran, County Donegal, but recently reprovenanced by John O'Neill in his very interesting paper in the UJA to Drumbohal, County Donegal, and as Pádraig O'Mahuna, the famous goldsmith from Cahill, said to me once, whoever made this would never have made a goldsmith, or at least not a good one anyway. Some of you will remember the great excitement we had a few years ago when a gold disc, 2 gold discs and a gold lunula were retrieved from a bin, effectively a bin, in Dublin, having been stolen from a chemist's shop in Strokestown in County Roscommon. This is the lunula and 2 gold discs from Cugglebeg in County Roscommon, the only associated find of a lunula and gold discs together from Ireland. In presenting this paper today, I would also like to pay tribute to Joan Taylor, who died a couple of years ago and whose contribution to the study of prehistoric gold from Britain, Ireland, and indeed Western Europe is, unsurpassed in many ways, and whose typology of lunulae, which was published in 1970, is still actively used today. So she identified 3 different types of lunulae: unaccomplished, classical, and provincial. So the unaccomplished and classical varieties are found in Ireland. The provincial is not found in Ireland. They are found singly and in hordes, but not in burials. Indeed, I suppose that's one of the things that we would love to find is a new discovery of lunulae in a context, in an archaeological context, where we would actually learn something more about their potential relationships, chronology, and function. They are, as I said, crescentic gold colours. They are plain at the centre here, but decorated on the inner and outer edges, and they have ordered panels of decoration on the narrow parts of the terminals. While the motifs while motifs are repeated, each lunula is different. Repetition, to me at any rate, because the corpus of motifs is quite limited, it suggests that the goldsmiths were limited to motifs that had specific meanings or symbolism that related to their purpose. In other words, the goldsmiths just couldn't produce any random design. They had to produce designs to a particular pattern, which was dictated to them in some way. Classical lunulae differ from the unaccomplished in that they are generally, the sheet to make the lunula is more professionally produced, is more skillfully produced. They have better balance in terms of the size and the nature of the shape of the lunula itself. And they are also exceptionally well decorated, with symmetry, balance, and mirror imaging being features of classical lunula. And this is particularly well exemplified in this example from Mangerton in County Kerry, now in the British Museum and formerly in the collection of Sir Thomas Tobin of Cork. Here you also see lunulae from Britain and from other parts of Europe. So on the left-hand side there, one from Cornwall, one of 4 lunulae from Cornwall, a couple of which have very close relations to the connections to Irish classical lunulae. And you see provincial lunulae from Brittany and other lunulae or lunula-type artifacts from Denmark, and this important one here from Portugal, also found with a pair of gold discs. Provincial lunulae tend to be rather thicker and heavier than the lunulae that are found in Ireland, and they're also not as extensively decorated, with a more limited range of motifs used to decorate them. So what is a lunula then, other than being perhaps something just nice to wear around your neck? So in terms of the way in which they're made and the shape that they take, a lune is the crescent shape formed by 2 intersecting circles, a concave convex shape allowing great variation in width and depth at the center. So you'll get an idea here of, the way the shape of the lunula can vary depending on how those 2 circles intersect. This form, the lune, has also been used to illustrate boats, crewed and uncrewed, from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. This is the shape that forms the basis of the idea that a lunula is more than an ornament. And again, just to remind you that similar forms can have shared and related meanings. And just to point out, here on the Petrie crown, here is the solar boat and the solar disc, as discussed by Don Waddell in his book on Celtic mythology and archaeology, which is an extremely interesting read in its own right for anybody who hasn't come across it before. So Elizabeth has already introduced us to some of the Neolithic connections between Ireland and down along the Atlantic facade there, and I'm just going to go back over that a little bit. So in terms of lunate or boat motifs, you'll see here, according to this distribution map which I've made, that I will suggest certainly that there are boat forms to be seen in terms of megalithic art in Ireland. There certainly, if we go with what Serge Cassin argues in his many papers, it's a very clearly defined form there, and can also be seen at various sites down through Iberia. And if we go a little bit towards the east along the southern coast of Spain there as well. Elizabeth mentioned already the falliform objects, or eidolos, or beetle stones as they're sometimes called, and I'll come back to that again later. So here, just to see a little bit more detail, some of these lunate forms. You've seen this slide already where Serge Cassin has illustrated these boat shapes, these lunate or boat shapes on stones from Brittany and from the Alentejo area of Portugal here. And I fully accept that not everybody present will necessarily agree with my interpretation, but I would certainly suggest that here on these stones from County Meath, Louth and Loughcrew and Ardmulcan, that you are looking at boat forms there. This definitely, if Serge Cassin was asked to interpret this, he would say that this is a crewed boat without any shadow of a doubt. Also show you some from a cave near Cadiz, where you can see the lunate forms again. And actually, this one is from La Palma. This is in the Canary Islands, so going a little bit further down the coast of West Africa, you see these lunate forms describing boats as well. Now, what's interesting about this particular site is that they've actually been able to radiocarbon date the pigment that is used to paint these forms. And they have got some nice late Neolithic and Chalcolithic dates from this particular site. So again, you've seen this object before, but I just want to point out this lunulae shape on it here. Serge Cassin again would relate this shape to these lunate forms seen on pottery from Brittany, and also again on the megalithic art. And just, I would point to this basin stone, now lost, but which is well known and illustrated from Nouth. And you've seen this illustration with Elizabeth again, showing the lunula form, or the boat shape, and perhaps the sun disk right there at the centre of it. This is how I, at any rate, would look at those particular images. If we move on from the Neolithic and into the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age periods, and look again at the same map of Europe and see the distribution of lunulae and the numbers there in terms of how they are represented. It's by far the majority of them, of course, have been found in Ireland, with smaller numbers in Britain, some in France, one or two as we go to the north, and then in Iberia, just that one example that you saw previously and which we'll see again. These lozenge shapes here are just there to indicate the presence of other related early goldwork in these parts of Europe. And here, a single symbol here to indicate lunulae in other forms. So this is lunulae represented on menhirs and in ivory and limestone, which I will come to in a moment. But before I do that, I want to just mention that very interesting article that was published in Archaeology in Ireland not too long ago about the relationship of the strawberry tree, the Arbutus unido, which is found in Killarney area and in northern Spain, which through genetic analysis, it's now been shown that the strawberry tree in Ireland had to originate from the strawberry tree, which is native to northern Spain. And it is particularly useful, apparently, in terms of making charcoal, and it is very locally associated in the area around Killarney, where the Ross Island copper mines are. So I'm just throwing that out there as another possible connection between Ireland and Iberia at this period when metalworking was being introduced to Ireland, both the use of copper, later bronze, and of course the use of gold as well. Because as we know, none of these were invented here, they were introduced, and there have to be ways of communication and transporting not just ideas, but people and materials as well. So again, just to look very briefly at the similarities that there are between goldwork found in Ireland, Britain, and Iberia at this time. You can just see that illustrated there on the screen, these discs from northern Spain, and these objects here, these rolled up, perhaps basket-type earrings, again, also from northern Spain. So you can see there are definitely similarities there, and there's something going on. So if we look at other forms of lunulae then, there is a most interesting series of early menhirs in the Évora district of southern Portugal. These have been studied in detail by, a number of people, but in particular by Gomes, who has produced several papers with illustrations of these. Serge Cassin has also drawn similarities between, or comparisons between these lunula shapes and the boat shapes that you see on the Breton material. And he would also draw similarities between the shape of what is would be described by Gomes as the nose, but would be seen by Casson as a shape that represents a space or a field or an area in terms of the Breton motifs. So he regards these menhirs as being pseudo-anthropomorphic, whereas Iberian scholars would regard them more as definitely anthropomorphic. But I just want to point out to you here on these stones that sometimes you get actual sort of zonal decoration on these collars. So in calling them pseudo-anthropomorphic, I wonder why Casson didn't actually consider the fact that you get these two circles here, perhaps indicating eyes, and then on sometimes you get two further circular forms in the breast area of these anthropomorphic menhirs, if that is indeed what they are. But my point really is to show you the lunula form. Now, these menhirs are Neolithic in date, but they have been reused and they have been redressed in the Chalcolithic period, and this is when their use as these anthropomorphic or pseudo-anthropomorphic figures comes into being. And for scholars like Gomes, they see them very much as representing beings from another world. They're not representing actual humans, but some kind of a spiritual connection to perhaps godlike figures or spiritual figures of some sort from another world. You also find in this area as well, not just these representations on the menhirs, but you find these limestone lunula-shaped objects. And I just want to point out these lines, these incised ridges, if you like, on these ones, and also a series of ivory lunulae from a very important site called Perdigosh, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, some people might argue, and it's quite a legitimate point, that it looks like these objects would be worn the other way around rather than in this sort of familiar lunula shape, but that doesn't actually mean that they can't represent either a combination of a sun and boat motif, because it all depends on how you view the movement of the sun, whether it's the daytime or the nighttime when the sun and the solar boat disappear into the sea. So just to look in a little bit more detail at the ivory lunulae from this tomb at Perdigosh, which is dated in two different phases between 2800 and 2200 BC. These are made from ivory imported from Africa. Now, it's quite extraordinary that in southern Spain you find, I suppose it's extraordinary to us because we're so far away from it, you find the use of African ivory at this time. You find ostrich shells being used, and there is a lot of trafficking of other exotic materials. In fact, with scientific analysis, they have identified 2 different species of African elephant used to make artifacts from ivory in Iberian sites, and also at a very important site near Seville called Valenciana de la Concepción, they actually have objects made from Indian ivory. So the Indian ivory is actually traveling all of that way across the world to find, finally to be deposited in this site in Spain. The interesting thing about this site in Portugal is that, as you'll notice here, there's only one complete lunula known from this site. All the others have been broken, and the left-hand side of the lunula has been deposited in the tomb. And the excavator of this site suggests that this is a way of maintaining a connection between the dead and the living. So in some form of perhaps ceremonial breakage of the object or breaking of the object, that one half is deposited in the tomb and the other half is retained by the living, maintaining that connection between both. Recently I have been looking at lunulae, and the fragmentation of lunulae I've sort of come to realize is very much more a feature of lunulae than I had realized in the past. And in an about to be published paper in the PRIA, I discuss a hoard of lunulae from Ballinderry, County Kildare. This is the biggest hoard ever found in Ireland. There were at least 5 lunulae in it when it was found, and each one of them was broken. Now, this one has been repaired, this one has been repaired, and here are the 3 fragments, 3 halves of the other 3, if you like. Where those other halves are, we just don't know, unfortunately. Whether they were ever deposited, we don't know, but it's likely that they were all deposited as broken pieces. So you would perhaps have had 10 fragments of lunulae in that particular deposit. And just to show that it's not just at Ballinderry, here you will see 2 others broken in much the similar way. Now, when I wrote in that article in Archaeology Ireland about reimagining the lunula as a solar boat, I was really depending on information, evidence coming from Scandinavia, where the story of the journey of the sun is so well described on the rock art that you find all over that area. But of course that is later in date than the lunulae themselves, so you're kind of projecting backwards, if you like, to try and imagine how the lunulae and discs might work together. And of course the obvious question is, how come more discs haven't been found with the lunulae if that is actually the case? So I'm just going to show you something quite unique, and this is one of 2 lunulae found at Rathroeen in County Mayo in the 1960s, but unfortunately reported very late, and so the site wasn't investigated. But here you see a treatment of one of the terminals of the lunula, where it has been decorated with these little rays, if you like, which to me, these terminals are also very rounded, but to me this is a way of incorporating the disc, the sun disk, into the lunula itself. So here in this one object we have the combination of lunula and disc. So if we think of the lunula then as a boat, as a solar boat to carry the sun on its journey, which is an idea that you find in so many different mythologies all over the world, from east to west and north to south. So there's nothing very unusual in that idea. It's a question of how it's expressed at different times and in different places. So in what way could a lunula actually represent a boat? So we have to change our perspective and look at the lunula in a different way. So here in this slide, I've tried to describe what I mean by that, changing your perspective. So you're looking at both sides of the boat here. So these are the gunnels. This is the bow and the stern. This is the body of the boat, if you like, the form of the boat, compared, as you see here, with this plan of a birch bark canoe. Very often you find that, so yes, I'll be coming back to all of this in a moment in more detail, but just again to suggest that these lines here might represent the thwarts, and these, as I said, the gunnels. These details then might represent the stitching of the boat, and I'll come back to that again. Now, in order to move the boat, obviously, you're going to require oars or paddles of some form. And so I would suggest that when we're looking at the terminals of the lunulae, that what we are seeing are the paddles or the oars. And as you'll see in this example here, you often get this very well-defined ridge through the middle of the terminal. And here you see this reflected in the paddles there. So if a lunula is a type of ship, then what type of ship could the lunula represent? So evidence from around the world shows us that people were capable of travelling great distances to reach new lands or to trade in commodities. Many different types of craft, from reed bundle boats, stitched bark canoes, stitched wooden boats and stitched skin boats are known. For example, we have the Middle Bronze Age stitched plank boats from Ferriby and Dover in England. But for long voyages, some maritime specialists suggest certainly that stitched skin boats are more suitable, or that, well, perhaps also stitched wooden boats would work too. But certainly McGrail and others have suggested that stitched skin boats might be more suitable. Here we're looking at a representation of a boat on a Chalcolithic period ceramic bowl from Los Millares in southern Spain, in Almeria. And this is one interpretation of this boat that you see here. Again, it's a question of perspective and how you look at the boat. So you can see the way this has been interpreted as the gunwales on either side here, the oars, and the oarlocks here, the stem and the prow. In another interpretation of this boat by another Spanish scholar, he has suggested that what you're seeing here is a dugout canoe, and that here the planking has been stitched. Now, this type of boat is known in many different parts of the world, and so it's possible it could be one or either of these interpretations. So can we learn from experimental archaeology and reconstructions? What might we learn from those? So here we're looking at a reconstruction of a stitched and lashed skin boat from Boyne near Pontevedra in Galicia in Spain. When I say the boat is from Pontevedra, what I mean is that the rock carvings that suggest this boat are from there. This boat is on exhibition in the museum in La Coruña. And if you look at the detail here of the way in which it's lashed, this diamond pattern is produced, and you can see this clearly on this lunula here and in the drawing here. And this is quite a common motif for lunulae. So many of the motifs that we see on the horns of lunulae can be not so much replicated, but certainly seen in terms of the way in which stitched or lashed boats are also made. Here is another example of lashing on a reed bundle boat from the Ganges in India. So if we look at other stitched boats, you can see this idea of the diamond-shaped stitching, the little lines here, and in particular on this birch bark boat, where the gunwale is being stitched to the boat itself, you get these groups of threads or thongs in 3 and 4 and 5 groups of lines like that, which is very much similar to what you get on the borders of many lunulae as well. Again, just to show you the detail there. And here in this stitched wooden boat, part of a project called the Jewel of Muscat, which was a project sorry. This is a very large boat that was made as part of one of these reconstruction and experimental projects in Oman a few years ago. And here again, you will see the V-shapes, the kind of interlocking V-shapes there, which again is a very common motif that is found decorating lunulae. So I suppose it's clear what I'm suggesting now is that very many of the motifs on lunulae can be identified or related to the stitching that you find on stitched boats of different kinds, both skin boats and wooden boats. So, boats on the water. Here we're looking at a reconstruction of a large seagoing curragh that it's called the Newgrange Sea Curragh Project and was based down in County Meath. And here you can see the way in which the leather is stitched together produces these prominent ridges here. And again, this may be replicated in some of the lines that we see drawn on the surface of lunulae, perhaps even here on these. This is a more unusual type of lunulae where the decoration goes in this direction rather than that direction. And we may be seeing a reflection of some of these details on the lunulae. Looking at this boat from a site in Portugal that Elizabeth mentioned earlier, what we have here is the boat on the water, and the water being suggested by this zigzag line. So the zigzag line may represent the water, it might represent stitching, it could represent both. And it is very clear, we see here again on the beautiful shale and gold boat from Wales, where we have the oars indicated here, but also the water underneath carrying the boat on its journey. So if we are to take this boat on the water, then it would need oars or paddles, as we said already. It might also need sails. And is there any way, in terms of looking at lunulae, that we might suggest that sails could have been produced? Again, looking at the project, the Boyne Curragh project, it was very interesting to see the type of sails that they used. This is wickerwork with rawhide strips kind of interlinked, producing this kind of checkerboard pattern. And in this unusual lunula from Draperstown in County Derry, we see a very similar checkerboard pattern reproduced. And sometimes we will see glimpses of this pattern on other lunulae as well, such as the one from Ballinderry that you see there. So I'm running out of time now, but I'm nearly there, Mert. Just to look at some real boats, we've seen the Welsh boat already. I should point out that it's hard to see that there are concentric circles here. Some suggest that they represent shields. I would say they represent solar motifs. And the same on these little copper or bronze boats from Denmark, which are all decorated with concentric circle motifs as well. So what might have been the inspiration for the idea of reproducing boats in gold or in other materials, as we've seen there? So there are numerous natural phenomena that might have given rise to these ideas, this idea of the sun sailing on a solar boat. And one of those phenomenon is what's called a circumzenithal arc, and which is caused by refraction of sunlight. This is not a rainbow, by the way, but it's caused by sunlight refracted through ice crystals, in particular cloud formations. And that might have inspired the development of the solar boat mythology, because in these times, the sky was actually regarded as a sea. It was a cosmic sea, effectively. It wasn't understood as the sky, but more like not exactly a body of water, but as a sea, through which the sun must journey on a daily basis to, goes across the sky and then into the underworld. It has to be protected and guided through the night until the sun rises again the next day. So here you'll see again from Los Miliares the depiction of the sun, and this is the boat with its crew and its oars. So you have two boats representing the day and night sun. And you can see then with the circumzenithal arc how very similar this is to what's represented on the Los Miliares boat. The other possibility, of course, is that it was solar eclipses that provided the kind of cosmic, I suppose, idea or the sense of the representation of the solar boat in this way. Gold in itself, of course, lends itself to that because of its colour and because of its everlasting qualities. But as the moon passes between the sun and the earth and you get the solar eclipse, you will get all of that variation, as you see here, in terms of the shape and the size of the lunula form, what we call a lunula form now. And again, I think we can see this represented, in my view in any case, in some of the megalithic art at Nouth. So, Shinawil, thank you all very much for listening. I'd just like to acknowledge the copyright holders of many of the images that I've used here, and just a more focal score, if I can, wish just to say, to point out from this painting by John Behan, you see the way he represents the currachs on the shore here. And I actually traced this out on a piece of tracing paper, just the boats and these people standing up here. And what do you think I got? Something that would be perfectly well at home on many of the megalithic art sites that we have seen. So, plus ça change. Thank you all very much.